And then the equal sign itself is what we call the assignment operator. So let's take a look at a simple example. So let's say we have the following lines of code. So the first line declares an integer type called x. The second line will initialize x to 5. So we take 5 and we store it in the memory cell that's located at x. And then the third line will evaluate what's on the right hand side. So we take the current value of x, so that's 5, and we add 6 to it, so that result becomes 11, and then we store that result into x. So after this third line, x will now store 11. Now it's worth mentioning that when a variable is declared, Java may not assign any initial value to it. So in fact, anything could be stored in the variable at that time. So when we declare it, there could be like some gibberish, there could be values in there, and we call this type of value that's initially in the variable a garbage value. And we really don't want this in our programs. In fact, if we try to use an uninitialized variable, the program is going to give us a compile error. And let me give you an example as to how and why this happens. So let's say I declare some integer variable, which we'll call x, and then I try to print x. So I say system.out.println x. Well, what is x? There's no value with it. There's some garbage value, and Java's not going to print it. So in this particular code, you're going to get a compile error that says something along the lines of Java doesn't know what's in there. It may have not been initialized. So we have to have some value in x before we can actually print it. So the way we can fix this is it's very simple. We just either initialize the variable as we declare it, or we just assign some value to it later on. But before we can use a variable in our code, we have to make sure there is some value stored in there. So in this case, if we wanted to initialize it as we declare, we can say something like int x equals 10. So we can initialize our variables on the same line as we declare it. The other approach for storing values into our variables is by using what we call an input statement or a read statement. And this handles the case where we would ask ourselves, how do we handle input from the user? So we talked about how we can directly store values into our variables in our code, but we should also give the user the ability to type in something on the keyboard and then have that value be stored in a variable. The way Java handles this is by providing a scanner class. Now we'll talk about classes in more details later on, but this particular class, the scanner class, allows us to handle user input. So let me give you the complete line of code that we would use. So this is our line, and so it says scanner console equals new scanner system.in. So what does this all mean? I mean, the first two parts, the scanner console, it's almost like a variable declaration, but it works just a little bit different. So don't worry, we will get to classes and objects later on. So the scanner here is our class. You can kind of think of this as a data type, but like I said, it's not the same thing as it's not exactly the same thing as a data type. It is a class, but we can think of it for now as like a data type. Console in this case is the name of the input stream object. And just like with variables, we could use some other name. We can use scanner keyboard. We can use scanner X if we wanted to. But to keep things consistent, we are going to use console as the name of our input stream object. The new scanner part will create a new object of that class. And if you don't know what that means, like I said, don't worry about it. We will talk about what it means to create objects of classes, but it's a way of storing something in our console, and we'll use this later on for our input. And then this system.in is what's called the standard input stream object. So this just means that our scanner class is allowing us to get input from a keyboard. System.in just simply means that we're getting keyboard input. And this should look pretty familiar. We've seen statements like system.out, and that is what's considered our standard output stream object, which means that we're outputting to the terminal or the monitor. So now that we have this console object of the scanner class, how does it work? How do we use this object to read in our input? Well, the way we handle it is by calling the appropriate method associated with the object. So if we want to store an integer, for example, we would use the line console.nextInt. So notice the I in int is capitalized and we have some parentheses. So we'll see some examples in a little bit on how we actually use it, but console.nextInt will allow the user to enter an integer and we can store that in some variable. If we want to store a double, we can use console.nextDouble, where the D is capitalized. If we want to store a string, we can use console.next. Now I should warn you with this particular method that it's only going to read up to the next space. So this string was only going to consist of a single word, but we can still read strings this way. If we want to store a string until the end of the line, or in other words, if we want a string that has multiple spaces in there, we can use console.nextLine, where the L is capitalized. With these methods, if we want to store what the user types, all we have to do is assign the results of that method to a variable. So let me give you an example. If I want to have the user type in an integer and store it in a variable x, I can just say int x equals console.nextInt. So the console.nextInt part is a method that evaluates to some integer. So we take that result and we store it in x. And as I said before, and I'm going to say again, make sure what you enter matches the data type. So for example, if you enter 5.6 when it was expecting an integer, you're going to get a runtime error. Your program is just going to blow up on you. Now, if we want to use the scanner class, we have these set of methods, we have to define them in our program. So the way we handle that is we have to include them in the program itself. Now, there's a very simple way we can handle that, because since these are pre-made methods, we just include the following line at the very beginning of our program. At the very, very top, before the public class part of our program. We just say import space java.util.star semicolon. And this is kind of this package that includes the scanner class and all the methods we just talked about as part of it. So this will allow us to import all of those methods, and then we can just call them as normal throughout our program. There is one more data type that we need to talk about. We've talked about how the user can input integers, doubles, and strings, but we haven't talked about how to handle characters. Is there a console.nextChar method? And the answer is no, that does not exist. Why Java hasn't decided to do this, I have no idea, but we just have to live with it. Now, fortunately, there is an approach that allows us to input characters by modifying the console.next method. Because remember, the .next method allows us to import, or read strings, I should say. So all we need is just the very first character of that string. So what we can do is put in console.next.char at 0. We'll talk more details how char at works later when we talk about strings. But the idea is that it will give us the very first character that's entered by the user. So just to give an example, I can declare a character variable char ch and set it equal to console.next.char at 0. So when the user types in even a full string, only the very first character of that gets stored into ch. So this is how we would normally take care of characters.